The fuel gauge didn't lie. It never did, and that's what made this moment impossible. 4 P-38 Lightnings touched down at Hollandia Air Base on the 1st day of July, 1944. New Guinea heat rising off the runway in waves you could see. 6.5 hours they'd been up there. 6.5 hours over Japanese territory where every mile was measured in heartbeats, and every gallon was the difference between home and the ocean. 3 pilots climbed out with tanks so close to empty you could hear the fuel sloshing. Maybe 50 gallons left if they were lucky. Enough for 20 minutes. Maybe 30 if you flew like your life depended on it. Which it did. The 4th aircraft was different. The pilot was 42 years old, a civilian. And when the ground crew chief pushed his fuel stick down into those wing tanks, he had to check it twice, then a 3rd time, because the reading made no sense. 210 gallons remaining, after the same mission, the same weather, the same airplane. Somehow this man had used 200 gallons less fuel than the best fighter pilots in the Pacific Theater. The crew chief stood there in the sun, fuel stick in his hand, staring at numbers that rewrote everything he thought he understood about flying. For months, these boys had been pushing these twin-engine fighters exactly like the manual demanded. 2200 RPM, auto-rich mixture settings. Every procedure drilled into them since the day they first sat in a cockpit. They'd been taught, really taught deep in their bones, that deviating from these standards would turn your engines into scrap metal at 20,000 feet. That running over square, high manifold pressure with low RPM was the kind of mistake that turned you into a statistic. But standing there on that New Guinea airstrip, watching fuel readings that made a mockery of everything the Army Air Forces believed, one question hung in the air heavier than the humidity. What if everything they'd been taught was wrong? The checkers made a sound when they moved across the board. A small tap that seemed too loud in the afternoon heat. Colonel Charles MacDonald barely heard it. His mind was 3 moves ahead, calculating positions and possibilities while sweat traced lines down his back. 29 years old and commanding the 475th Fighter Group. But in this moment, he was just a man trying to beat Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith at a game that had nothing to do with combat radius or fuel consumption or the weight of command decisions that killed good men. The knock at the screen door was soft, polite almost. The kind of knock that suggested the person on the other side knew they were interrupting but had something worth interrupting for. "Excuse me, gentlemen?" The voice carried something, not quite authority, but certainty. The kind of voice that made you look up whether you wanted to or not. MacDonald's hand froze halfway to a red checker piece. His eyes found the doorway. Found the man standing there in navy khakis that looked impossibly crisp, despite air so humid you could drink it. Middle-aged. Unremarkable at first glance. The kind of face you might pass in a crowd without a second thought. "I'm Charles Lindbergh." The name landed like a bomb with a delayed fuse. You heard it, processed it, then felt the shockwave. Smith's eyes went wide. MacDonald found himself staring, trying to reconcile legend with flesh. This man, standing here in their makeshift headquarters at the edge of nowhere. This was the same pilot who'd crossed the Atlantic alone 17 years ago, when crossing the Atlantic alone was considered somewhere between bravery and insanity. The spirit of St. Louis wasn't just history. It was the moment flying stopped being a circus act and became the future. And now he was here, in their tent, asking about P-38s like he was just another pilot passing through. That Charles Lindbergh. The words came out before MacDonald could stop them. "The one who flew to Paris? General Hutchinson sent me." Lindbergh stepped inside, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago not to waste motion. "He thought I might discuss P-38 combat operations with you." MacDonald stood, the checker game forgotten, pieces frozen in mid-battle. "Of course, Mr. Lindbergh. Please." He gestured to a folding chair that had seen better days and called for Colonel Warren Lewis. If they were going to talk P-38 operations, Lewis needed to hear this. He commanded the 403rd Fighter Squadron, and knew better than anyone the brutal mathematics of their current situation. The numbers that haunted every briefing, the calculations that turned young men's hair gray. Lewis arrived fast, flight suit still damp from the morning's heat. He took one look at their visitor, and something cracked in his professional composure. Just for a second, but it was there. "Mr. Lindbergh, what brings you to our corner of paradise?" The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Paradise with metal hangars that baked under tropical sun. Paradise with mud that never dried, and insects immune to every repellent the quartermaster could scrounge. But Lewis's question was genuine. What could the most famous aviator in the world possibly want with their daily struggle to keep fighters flying over an ocean that swallowed men whole? "I'm here to learn." Lindbergh settled into the chair like it was the most natural thing in the world. And perhaps share some observations about long-range flying. Lewis pulled out a map. The paper was worn soft at the folds, marked with grease pencil lines that told stories of missions flown and men lost. His finger traced routes across hundreds of miles of blue. Blue that looked peaceful on paper, but represented the most hostile environment a pilot could face. Water. Endless water. And if you went down out there, rescue was a prayer. Not a plan. 6 hours. Lewis's voice carried the weight of too many calculations. 7 hours. That's what we're asking these boys to fly now. Missions that were impossible a year ago are routine. And the fuel margins, he shook his head. Didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. MacDonald watched Lindbergh study that map with eyes that saw more than islands and distances. Those pale blue eyes moved systematically, precisely, calculating with the focus of someone who'd spent decades thinking about range and endurance. This wasn't curiosity. This was evaluation. The look of a man who understood that fuel wasn't just numbers on a gauge. It was time, distance, life. The P-38L has a published combat radius of 570 miles. Lewis tapped the map. In practice, we're pushing that envelope every single mission. Standard procedure calls for 2200 to 2400 RPM, auto-rich mixture. Fuel consumption runs over 100 gallons per hour total. Lindbergh nodded slowly, but something shifted in his expression. Not confusion, recognition. Like a doctor hearing symptoms he'd diagnosed 1,000 times before. These boys come back exhausted. Lewis's voice dropped. 7 hours in that cockpit is torture. Sitting on a parachute, emergency raft, gear. The physical strain is one thing, but the mental pressure. He gestured at the map again, at all that blue. Every mission brief becomes a fuel calculation. How much reserve? How long over target? What's our point of no return? MacDonald had seen that pressure up close. Young pilots, some barely old enough to drink legally, hunched over flight planning tables with slide rules and pencils, calculating margins that determined whether they'd see another sunrise. Too many good men lost to empty tanks rather than enemy bullets. The ocean didn't care how good a pilot you were. Run out of fuel, and the mathematics were simple. Unforgiving. Final. And it's getting worse, Lewis added quietly. Targets keep getting farther away. Rabaul, Wewak. Now we're talking Philippines. The war's moving west, but our fuel capacity isn't growing with it. Lindbergh listened without interrupting, but his questions, when they came, were surgical, specific, technical, mixture settings, propeller pitch, cruise altitudes, the kind of questions that revealed knowledge most combat flyers never reached. This wasn't fame asking polite questions. This was expertise drilling down to fundamentals. Have you experimented with different cruise settings? Lewis and MacDonald exchanged glances, the kind of glance that said everything without words. The technical orders are pretty specific. Lewis chose his words carefully. We follow standard procedures. High RPM, rich mixtures. That's what keeps these Allisons running. Something flickered across Lindbergh's face. Not disagreement exactly. More like the expression of someone who'd heard conventional wisdom that didn't match reality. Mr. Lindbergh, MacDonald leaned forward. You mentioned observations. What kind of observations? For the first time since walking into their quarters, Lindbergh smiled. Barely. Just enough to suggest he'd been waiting for that question. Would you be interested in a practical demonstration? I checked out in the P-38 a few days ago. Flew Dick Bong's old aircraft to base. I'd like to join one of your combat missions. The request hung there between them. Heavy. Complicated. MacDonald felt command settle on his shoulders like a physical weight. Taking a civilian, even Charles Lindbergh, on combat operations carried risks that went beyond normal parameters. But something in the man's quiet confidence suggested this wasn't idle curiosity. What did you have in mind? The recreation hall at Hollandia had the tired look of every military building in every forgotten corner of every war. Dirt floors packed hard by months of boots. Palm thatch roof that leaked when it rained, which was often. One ping-pong table, serving as the squadron's primary entertainment. Unshaded bulbs hanging from rafters, casting shadows that made young faces look old, and old faces look ancient. MacDonald stood near what passed for a podium, really just a wooden crate turned on end, and surveyed his assembled pilots. 43 men, most under 25, all wearing that look, the 1,000-yard stares that came from too many hours over hostile territory with fuel gauges constantly in mind. Some sat on folding chairs, liberated from God knows where. Others cross-legged on the floor. A few leaned against walls with arms crossed and expressions that said they'd heard every briefing worth hearing, and most that weren't. Gentlemen. MacDonald's voice cut through the low murmur. Mr. Lindbergh has something to share about extending our range. Lindbergh stepped forward with measured confidence. The confidence of someone accustomed to skeptical audiences. He wore the same navy khakis from 2 days earlier. But MacDonald noticed the details now. Civilian watch, no regulation insignia, the way he moved with unconscious grace around aircraft. The kind of grace that came from decades, not years. Reduce your standard 2,200 RPM to 1,600. No warm-up, no context, just the specification that would either save lives or destroy engines. Set fuel mixtures to auto-lean instead of auto-rich. Increase manifold pressures, slightly to compensate. The silence that followed was as specific. MacDonald had heard it before. Not confusion, mental grinding. Pilots trying to reconcile what they'd just heard with everything sacred in their training. Lieutenant Bobby Johnson raised his hand tentatively. Steady formation leader. Good instincts. Sir, are you saying we cut RPM to 1,600 and use 30 inches of mercury manifold pressure? That's correct. Lindbergh's voice carried absolute certainty. Fuel savings run between 50 and 100 gallons per mission, depending on conditions and duration. The silence deepened. MacDonald watched faces, read the mix of hope and horror, playing across features too young to carry so much responsibility. Hope because longer range meant better survival odds. More tactical flexibility, targets that had been dreams becoming possibilities. Horror because every flight instructor, every technical manual, every engine school had taught them the same fundamental principle, carved in stone, written in blood, never run, over square. Captain Jim Watkins voiced what everyone thought. Mr. Lindbergh, that's going to burn up our engines. We've been taught that low RPM with high manifold pressure causes detonation. You've been taught wrong. Lindbergh didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The quiet authority of absolute certainty carried more weight than volume ever could. The technique works because you're maintaining high manifold pressure while backing off RPM, not running both high simultaneously. Combined with auto-lean mixture instead of auto-rich, this reduces fuel consumption to approximately 70 gallons per hour total. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, 22 years old, and still carrying the eager intensity of recent graduation, did the mathematics aloud. 70 gallons per hour versus our current 100 plus. That's almost 30% reduction. More than that, Lindbergh replied. Flying at 185 miles per hour indicated, this technique provides roughly 2.6 miles per gallon. Your combat radius extends from 570 miles to 700, possibly 750, depending on conditions. The numbers hung in the humid air, like ordnance waiting to explode. MacDonald watched calculations running behind eyes, trying to grasp what those figures meant in practical terms. 750-mile combat radius translated to missions they'd considered impossible, deep strikes into Japanese territory that had been beyond their fuel envelope, dreams becoming operational reality. But the resistance ran deeper than mathematics. These men had survived by following procedures that kept engines running and aircraft flying. The Allison V-1710 engines in their P-38s were finicky enough under normal conditions. Tampering with established settings felt like gambling with lives. Sir, Major Pete Peterson, veteran of Robble missions who'd earned his skepticism through hard experience. Every technical order warns against oversquare operation, the risk of engine knock, piston damage. The procedure appears controversial because you've been trained to believe it would damage engines. Lindbergh's patience seemed infinite. But consider the source of that training. How many of your instructors had experience with sustained long-range cruise flight? How many had operated these specific power plants under extended endurance conditions? The question cut deep because the answer was obvious. 0. Military flight training focused on combat maneuvering, formation flying, gunnery. Not the kind of efficient long-range cruise techniques that Lindbergh had perfected during decades of civilian aviation. Technical orders written by engineers who prioritized engine longevity over operational range, assuming fuel capacity rather than consumption would determine mission limits. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, silent until now, finally spoke. "Mr. Lindbergh, you're asking us to fly 9-hour missions. 7 hours in a Lightning cockpit is already torture. Sitting on emergency equipment, dealing with oxygen system quirks, fighting fatigue that affects judgment." He gestured toward the assembled pilots. 9 hours seems beyond human endurance. MacDonald nodded grimly. The physical challenges were real. P-38 cockpits cramped under the best circumstances. Long missions meant sitting on parachutes, emergency rafts, survival gear for hours. Oxygen masks became increasingly uncomfortable. Radio headsets caused pressure points, and the mental strain of navigation over featureless ocean wore down even experienced pilots. The endurance challenge is legitimate, Lindbergh acknowledged. But consider the alternative. How many pilots have you lost to fuel starvation? How many missions aborted because fuel margins didn't allow sufficient time over target? The question struck home because every pilot in that room knew the answers. Too many good men disappeared over the Pacific, aircraft simply vanishing when fuel ran out hundreds of miles from land. Others forced to turn back short of targets, allowing enemy installations to remain operational for lack of sufficient fuel. The choice isn't between comfort and discomfort, Lindbergh continued quietly. It's between proven techniques that extend your operational capability and conventional methods that may be limiting your effectiveness unnecessarily. MacDonald studied faces around him, reading curiosity and concern in expressions. These were combat veterans who'd learned to trust equipment and training, but they were also pragmatists who understood survival often depended on adapting to new information. "Mr. Lindbergh," MacDonald said finally, "would you be willing to demonstrate this technique on an actual combat mission?" The morning of July 3rd dawned clear over Hollandia, visibility stretching to the horizon for the first time in a week. MacDonald stood beside his P-38 Lightning at 5:30, watching ground crews complete pre-flight inspections while tropical air still carried relative coolness of night. Today's mission would test everything Lindbergh claimed. 1,280 miles round trip, the kind of distance that pushed conventional fuel planning to absolute limits. Lindbergh emerged from the operations tent carrying flight gear with deliberate movements of ritual performed thousands of times. Borrowed flight suit fit reasonably well, though MacDonald noticed civilian flying boots instead of standard military issue. More telling was the ease with which he handled equipment. Parachute harness, Mae West life jacket, oxygen mask, survival kit, everything arranged with efficiency of long practice. "Weather looks good for the demonstration," Lindbergh observed, glancing toward the eastern horizon, where sun was beginning to burn off overnight haze. Visibility should remain clear. Winds minimal. MacDonald nodded, though his attention focused on fuel calculations he'd run 3 times during the night. Standard cruise settings would require every drop of internal fuel capacity, with virtually no reserve for combat maneuvering or unexpected headwinds. If Lindbergh's technique failed to deliver promised savings, they'd be calculating glide ratios over open ocean. "Tommy's flying your wing today." MacDonald indicated where Major Thomas. McGuire was completing his own pre-flight inspection, 2 aircraft down the flight line. "He'll be watching your fuel consumption closely." McGuire looked up at mention of his name. Brief wave. America's second highest scoring ace had volunteered for this mission specifically to observe Lindbergh's methods under combat conditions. If the technique worked for someone with McGuire's aggressive flying style, it would work for anyone. Briefing had been straightforward. Patrol sectors northeast of current position. Possible ground attack opportunities against Japanese supply installations on several small islands. Nothing extraordinary by recent standards, but distance involved would test both fuel efficiency and human endurance. Lindbergh climbed into his cockpit with practiced efficiency, movements economical and precise. MacDonald watched him run through checklist, noting the civilian pilot took extra time with fuel system configurations. Unlike standard military procedure, Lindbergh adjusted mixture controls to auto-lean settings before engine start. Propeller controls set for lower RPM than any P-38 pilot had been trained to use. Engine start proceeded normally, both Allison V-1710s coming to life with characteristic whine as turbo superchargers spooled up to operating speed. But once taxi clearance came through, MacDonald noticed the difference immediately. Lindbergh's engines ran noticeably quieter than standard settings. Exhaust note deeper, less aggressive. Hollandia Tower. Lightning flight requesting takeoff clearance. Lightning flight cleared for takeoff. Runway 27. Wind calm, visibility unlimited. 4 P-38s lifted off in formation, climbing steadily through 3,000 feet as they headed northeast toward patrol area. MacDonald kept throttles and mixture controls at regulation settings while maintaining visual contact with Lindbergh's aircraft flying on his right wing. Even during climb, he could see Lindbergh's engines appeared to develop identical power, despite different configurations. At cruise altitude, the demonstration began in earnest, reducing RPM to 1600. Manifold pressure 30 inches. Mixture auto-lean. Airspeed 185 indicated. Lindbergh's voice came through radio with technical precision. MacDonald cross-checked his own instruments, his aircraft consuming fuel at expected rate, approximately 52 gallons per hour per engine, 104 total. But visual observations suggested Lindbergh's aircraft maintaining identical airspeed and altitude, despite radically different engine settings. First hour passed uneventfully, navigation proceeding exactly as planned. MacDonald found himself checking fuel flow instruments more frequently than usual, comparing consumption rates against mission planning calculations. Everything matched expected performance, which made Lindbergh's claim seem increasingly significant. If the civilian pilot was actually achieving 30% fuel savings while maintaining cruise performance, implications for Pacific operations were staggering. Lead. I'm showing fuel flow approximately 20% below normal for this phase of flight. McGuire's voice at the 1 hour 30-minute mark confirmed what MacDonald had begun to suspect. Even McGuire, flying standard cruise settings but observing Lindbergh's technique closely, was unconsciously adopting more efficient power management. The psychological effect of watching fuel conservation in action was influencing flying habits across the formation. 2 hours into the mission, they encountered their first tactical situation. Intelligence reports had indicated possible Japanese barge traffic near Samate Island. Visual reconnaissance confirmed several targets anchored in protected cove. Standard attack procedure called for high-speed passes with full power settings. Exactly the kind of fuel-intensive maneuvering that made long-range missions problematic. Lightning flight, this is lead. Target area ahead. Prepare for ground attack. MacDonald pushed throttles forward. Felt both engines respond with increased power as fuel flow jumped to maximum combat settings. Attack run proceeded normally. Diving approaches. Multiple strafing passes. Defensive maneuvering to avoid anti-aircraft fire. But he noticed Lindbergh maintained formation throughout the engagement, his aircraft responding normally to combat power demands, despite unconventional cruise configuration. Engagement lasted 12 minutes, all 4 aircraft expending significant ammunition against barges and shore installations. During climb back to cruise altitude, MacDonald reset engines to standard long-range settings while monitoring fuel remaining. Combat power had consumed fuel at expected rates, leaving him with approximately 60% capacity for return flight. Lead, fuel check, 2 showing 60% remaining. McGuire's reply, 3, 58%. 4, 72% remaining, Lindbergh reported quietly, matter of fact, like he was reading coordinates instead of numbers that defied physics. MacDonald double-checked his radio, certain he'd misheard. 72%. After 2 hours of cruise flight and 12 minutes of combat maneuvering, Lindbergh still had nearly 3/4 of his fuel load remaining. The numbers were impossible according to everything MacDonald understood about P-38 fuel consumption. Vorsay again, fuel remaining. 72% confirmed. Fuel flow during cruise has averaged approximately 70 gallons per hour total. The mathematics were undeniable. While MacDonald's aircraft had consumed roughly 200 gallons during first phase of their mission, Lindbergh had used only 140 gallons for identical distance and flight time. 30% reduction in consumption, exactly as promised. But seeing it demonstrated under combat conditions transformed theoretical possibilities into operational reality. Return flight provided additional confirmation. Despite maintaining formation, airspeed, and altitude, Lindbergh's fuel consumption remained consistently lower than standard cruise settings. By the time Hollandia came into sight, MacDonald was calculating fuel margins that seemed almost luxurious compared to their normal tight planning. Landing revealed the full extent of demonstration success. Ground crews immediately began fuel measurements using calibrated dipsticks to determine exact consumption for each aircraft. MacDonald had returned with 18% fuel remaining, adequate for mission completion, but offering little reserve for unexpected circumstances. Lindbergh climbed out of his cockpit with 34%, fuel still in his tanks. Enough for nearly another hour of flight time. Enough to reach targets they'd never dreamed of attacking. Enough to rewrite every assumption about what was possible in this war. The skepticism cracked first among ground crews. Technical Sergeant Mike Kowalski had been working on P-38 engines since before Pearl Harbor. He understood fuel consumption the way a banker understood compound interest, through daily, meticulous observation of numbers that never lied. When Lindbergh's Lightning consistently returned from missions with fuel readings that defied every manual Kowalski had studied, the veteran mechanic began asking questions that cut through military hierarchy. Colonel MacDonald, sir, Kowalski, after the 5th consecutive mission, where Lindbergh's fuel consumption ran 30% below standard rates. Either this civilian's got magic engines or everything we've been taught about cruise settings is wrong. MacDonald found himself nodding more frequently during these conversations. Evidence mounting with mathematical precision that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Mission after mission, Lindbergh returned with fuel quantities that should have been impossible given distances flown and time airborne. More significantly, his engines showed no signs of damage that military doctrine insisted would result from oversquare operation. Pilot resistance proved more stubborn than mechanical evidence. Lieutenant Hayes, who'd volunteered to try Lindbergh's technique on a training flight, returned from his first attempt visibly shaken by psychological pressure of running engines in configurations that contradicted everything he'd been taught. It felt wrong the entire time. Sir, he reported to MacDonald, like waiting for something to explode. But Hayes also reported fuel consumption that matched Lindbergh's claims almost exactly, 73 gallons per hour, total compared to his usual 100-plus gallon burn rate. The lieutenant's fuel gauges didn't care about his psychological comfort. They simply recorded mathematical reality of improved efficiency. Major Peterson represented the old guard's final stand against the new technique. Veteran of missions over heavily defended Japanese positions, Peterson had survived by following procedures that kept aircraft flying when other pilots pushed luck too far. Mr. Lindbergh, he said during one particularly heated discussion in operations tent, "You're asking us to bet our lives on techniques that go against everything we know about engine management." Lindbergh's response carried patient tone of someone accustomed to technical skepticism. "Major, what you know about engine management comes from training designed for different operational requirements. Short-duration flights, maximum power settings, conservative safety margins appropriate for training environments." He gestured toward Mission Planning Board, covered with routes stretching hundreds of miles across empty ocean. These missions demand efficiency techniques that weren't part of standard military curriculum. The breakthrough came during a mission to WWII on July 28th. MacDonald had planned the strike as standard formation attack against Japanese supply installations, but intelligence reports suggested heavy fighter opposition, the kind of extended air-to-air combat that would test every aspect of aircraft performance under most demanding conditions possible. Lindbergh flew on McGuire's wing that day, positioning himself where the squadron's most experienced combat pilot could observe his techniques during actual aerial combat. Mission profile called for 400-mile transit to target area, followed by potential air-to-air engagement, ground attack, and return flight. Exactly the kind of complex operation where fuel management could mean difference between mission success and disaster. They encountered Japanese aircraft exactly as intelligence predicted. Formation of Mitsubishi Ki-51 dive bombers, escorted by Zero fighters approaching WWII from northwest. Engagement began with standard tactics: altitude advantage, coordinated attacks, aggressive maneuvering to gain firing positions. But as dogfight extended beyond normal duration, fuel consumption became a critical factor for every pilot involved. MacDonald watched aerial combat unfold with detached precision of commander who'd seen too many similar engagements. P-38's maneuvering against Japanese fighters in three-dimensional chess matches where split-second decisions determined survival. Ammunition expenditure, fuel burn rates, tactical positioning, all factored into calculations pilots made instinctively while pulling multiple Gs in combat turns. Japanese formation leader, later identified as Captain Saburo Shimada, demonstrated aggressive flying that had made Zero pilots legendary during early war years. Shimada's aircraft cut through defensive maneuvers with precision suggesting hundreds of combat hours, forcing American pilots to respond with maximum power settings that consumed fuel at rates far above cruise consumption. Multiple bandits, ammunition running low, fuel becoming a factor. McGuire's voice crackled through radio during brief lull in engagement. It was the kind of situation that separated experienced combat pilots from those who hadn't yet learned to manage multiple crisis factors simultaneously. Ammunition, fuel, enemy aircraft capabilities, distance to base, weather conditions, all demanding immediate evaluation, while maintaining situational awareness in three-dimensional combat. Lindbergh's aircraft maneuvered through engagement with same precise control he demonstrated during cruise flight. No wasted motion, no unnecessary power settings. Consistent tactical positioning that suggested complete comfort with P-38 handling characteristics. When Shimada's damaged aircraft turned directly toward Lindbergh in what appeared to be ramming attack, the civilian pilot's response was immediate and decisive. Brief engagement ended with Shimada's aircraft spiraling toward ocean, trailing smoke and debris. Lindbergh had scored his first and only aerial victory of the war, but significance extended beyond individual combat success. He'd proven fuel-efficient cruise techniques didn't compromise combat effectiveness when applied by pilots who understood both engine management and tactical. Flying return flight provided final confirmation of technique's practical value. McDonald's formation had been airborne over 8 hours, including extended combat maneuvering at maximum power settings. Standard fuel planning would have left most pilots calculating emergency landing options or considering water landings if headwinds increased. Instead, they landed at Hollandia with fuel reserves that seemed almost luxurious. McDonald touched down with enough fuel remaining for another hour of flight. Maguire, who'd been experimenting with modified cruise settings throughout mission, reported similar margins. But Lindbergh's fuel gauges showed quantities that still seemed impossible. Enough remaining fuel for nearly 2 additional hours of flight time. Ground crew post-flight inspections revealed no engine damage, no unusual wear patterns, no mechanical problems that would suggest harmful effects from over-square operation. Kowalski's detailed examination of Lindbergh's engines actually showed slightly less wear than comparable aircraft operated under standard settings, suggesting efficient cruise techniques might actually extend engine life rather than shorten it. Word of combat success spread through 475th Fighter Group with speed of all significant military news. Lindbergh had demonstrated fuel efficiency under most demanding operational conditions. Proven combat effectiveness against experienced enemy pilots, returned with engine condition that contradicted every warning about over-square damage. Major Peterson approached McDonald that evening with grudging respect of someone whose professional skepticism had been overcome by undeniable evidence. "Colonel, I'd like to request permission to try Mr. Lindbergh's techniques on tomorrow's patrol mission." The dam had finally broken. Within a week, every pilot in the squadron was experimenting with reduced RPM settings and auto-lean mixtures. Results matched Lindbergh's predictions with mathematical consistency. 30% fuel savings, extended range capabilities, no mechanical problems that hadn't been predicted by obsolete training doctrine. McDonald realized they'd witnessed more than technical demonstration. They'd seen institutional knowledge challenged and overturned by evidence that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. By August 1944, transformation was complete. What had begun as one civilian's controversial suggestion had become standard operating procedure across every P-38 unit in Pacific Theater. Flight manuals hastily revised, technical orders rewritten. Instructor pilots found themselves teaching techniques that directly contradicted everything they'd learned during their own training. Institutional revolution had occurred with startling speed, driven by results commanders couldn't ignore. McDonald stood in operations tent, studying mission planning boards that would have been impossible just months earlier. Routes stretched deep into Japanese-held territory, 950-mile round trips to Balikpapan, extended patrols over Saliba's Sea, escort missions that pushed P-38 capabilities to limits previous doctrine had considered fantasy. Numbers told story with mathematical precision. Combat radius increased from 570 miles to 750. Fuel consumption reduced by 30%. Mission capability expanded by 40% in flight time. Colonel Lewis approached with latest operational reports, expression carrying satisfied look of officer whose tactical problems had been solved by unexpected innovation. The 432nd Squadron completed an 8-hour escort mission to Borneo yesterday. He reported, "Full formation, no fuel emergencies, adequate reserves for combat maneuvering over target." Significance wasn't lost on McDonald. 8-hour missions had been theoretical discussions just 4 months earlier. Now they represented routine operations pilots planned with confidence rather than desperate hope. Psychological transformation matched technical advancement. Crews no longer calculated fuel margins with grim precision of men expecting to die from empty tanks over endless ocean. Technical Sergeant Kowalski had become unexpected expert on new procedures, training ground crews throughout Pacific on mixture settings and power management that maximized fuel efficiency. His maintenance reports consistently showed engine condition, that matched or exceeded standard operational parameters, definitively disproving decades of warnings about oversquare damage. Engines operated under Mr. Lindbergh's settings are actually showing less wear than comparable. Aircraft run at standard cruise power, Kowalski reported during one of their regular maintenance briefings. Lower combustion temperatures, reduced mechanical stress, improved fuel atomization, extending service life rather than shortening it. Technical vindication represented more than mechanical validation. It suggested institutional knowledge codified in training manuals and perpetuated through military instruction could be fundamentally wrong about basic operational principles. Implications reached far beyond fuel consumption into questions about how military organizations evaluated and adopted new information. Lieutenant Hayes, now one of a squadron's most vocal advocates for new techniques, had personally flown over 200 hours using Lindbergh's methods. His logbook documented fuel savings that accumulated into tactical advantages measurable in combat effectiveness, sir. He told MacDonald during mission debrief, "Yesterday's patrol to Halmahera would have been impossible under old cruise settings. We flew for 9 hours, engaged enemy aircraft over target, landed with fuel remaining for another hour of flight. Human element had proven as adaptable as technical systems. Pilots initially concerned about 9-hour endurance missions discovered reduced engine noise and vibration from lower RPM settings actually decreased fatigue during extended flights. Cockpit comfort improved. Oxygen system demands remained manageable. Psychological pressure of fuel calculations diminished to acceptable levels. Major McGuire had emerged as technique's most effective advocate among combat pilots. His reputation carried weight throughout fighter community. His endorsement of Lindbergh's methods influenced pilots across multiple squadrons. The old way of thinking about fuel management was killing us, McGuire observed during gathering of squadron leaders, not through mechanical failure, but through self-imposed limitations that prevented us from reaching targets that should have been within our capability. Strategic implications became apparent as mission planners realized P-38 units could now strike targets previously reserved for longer-range bombers. Japanese installations beyond fighter reach were suddenly accessible to formations capable of flying nearly 10 hours with adequate fuel reserves for combat operations. Tactical balance in Pacific shifted as American fighters gained operational range that matched vast distances of oceanic warfare. Word of fuel efficiency, breakthroughs spread through unofficial channels, connecting P-38 pilots across entire Pacific theater. Squadron commanders from Australia to the Aleutians began requesting detailed briefings on cruise techniques that promised to extend their operational capabilities. Informal network of communication among fighter pilots carried technical information faster than official military channels. MacDonald found himself fielding requests from units as far away as China-Burma-India theater, where P-38 pilots faced similar range limitations over equally challenging terrain. Techniques Lindbergh had demonstrated over Pacific waters proved equally effective over Himalayan peaks and Burmese jungles. Confirming fuel efficiency principles transcended specific operational environments. By late 1944, training squadrons in United States had incorporated new cruise procedures into standard instruction curricula. Newly graduated pilots arrived in Pacific combat units already familiar with techniques their predecessors had learned through dangerous trial and error over hostile territory. Institutional learning curve compressed from months of combat experience into weeks of systematic training. Statistical evidence became overwhelming as operational reports accumulated. Pilot survival rates improved measurably as fuel-related emergencies decreased. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the numbers told a story that couldn't be ignored. Fewer aircraft lost to fuel starvation, fewer emergency landings, fewer men disappearing over water that stretched to every horizon. Mission success rates increased as formations could remain over target areas for extended periods. What had once been hit-and-run attacks, drop ordnance, turn for home before fuel became critical. Now became sustained operations. Fighters could loiter, could wait for optimal attack opportunities, could provide cover for bombers that previously flew without adequate escort because the math simply didn't work. Enemy installations previously protected by distance became vulnerable to regular attack by fighters capable of reaching them with adequate fuel reserves. Japanese commanders who'd grown accustomed to immunity beyond certain range circles suddenly found American P-38s appearing over targets they'd considered safe. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical advantage. MacDonald saw it in captured intelligence reports. Increasing references to American fighters operating at ranges Japanese analysts had calculated as impossible. Confusion about how P-38 units were achieving endurance that exceeded published specifications. The enemy was being forced to recalculate their own defensive strategies based on American capabilities they didn't fully understand. Lindbergh's departure from Hollandia in August 1944 marked the end of his direct involvement with Pacific operations. He left quietly, no ceremony, no formal recognition, just a civilian heading back to whatever work waited for him in a world that had moved on from lone Atlantic crossings to global industrial warfare. But his technical contribution continued to influence combat effectiveness throughout remaining war years. He left behind a cadre of pilots and ground crews who understood fuel management principles that would serve as foundation knowledge for jet-powered aircraft development in post-war era. The lessons learned over Pacific waters would echo through decades of military aviation development. The institutional lesson extended beyond aviation into broader questions about military doctrine and innovation. The P-38 fuel efficiency breakthrough had demonstrated that conventional wisdom, even when supported by extensive training programs and technical documentation, could be fundamentally incorrect about basic operational principles. Think about that for a moment. Everything in the manual said one thing. Decades of training said one thing. Experienced instructors who'd survived combat said one thing. And all of it was wrong. Not slightly off, not imprecise. Wrong at the most fundamental level. The speed with which new techniques replaced established procedures suggested military organizations could adapt rapidly when presented with evidence that couldn't be dismissed. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about how many other established procedures might be equally flawed, how many other assumptions, carved in stone and taught as gospel, might be limiting effectiveness unnecessarily. MacDonald's final mission report to higher headquarters quantified transformation in terms that spoke directly to strategic planners. Combat radius extended by 31%. Fuel consumption reduced by 30%. Mission duration capability increased by 40%. These numbers weren't abstractions. They translated into tactical advantages that influenced air campaign planning throughout Pacific theater. They established precedents for long-range fighter operations that would continue through Korean War and beyond. They proved that sometimes the most significant innovations came not from new technology or advanced engineering, but from questioning assumptions everyone had accepted as truth. The quiet revolution that began with one civilian suggestion to try different engine settings had fundamentally changed how America's most important fighter aircraft operated in the world's largest theater of war. But maybe the real story wasn't about fuel consumption or engine settings or combat radius. Maybe it was about the courage to question what everyone knew was true. The willingness to test conventional wisdom against actual evidence. The intellectual honesty to admit when decades of training had been based on incomplete understanding. Lieutenant Hayes summed it up during one of their last conversations before MacDonald rotated back to the States. They were sitting in the operations tent, reviewing mission logs that documented hundreds of flights using Lindbergh's techniques. Not a single engine failure attributable to the new settings. Not one mechanical problem that the old doctrine had predicted with absolute certainty. "You know what's crazy, sir?" Hayes said, flipping through pages of fuel consumption data. We were losing guys because we believed something that wasn't true. Not because the enemy was better, not because our equipment was inadequate, but because we'd convinced ourselves that the safe way to fly was actually limiting what we could accomplish. MacDonald nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing for months. How many pilots had they lost in those early days? How many missions had failed because they'd turned back short of target, convinced they didn't have enough fuel? How many tactical opportunities had they missed because everyone absolutely knew that you couldn't fly P-38s the way Lindbergh said you could? The numbers in those mission logs represented more than fuel saved. They represented lives saved, missions accomplished, strategic objectives achieved. All because one man had walked into their tent and quietly suggested that maybe, just maybe, conventional wisdom was wrong. Technical Sergeant Kowalski maintained the most detailed records of engine performance under the new operating procedures. His maintenance logs became reference documents that spread throughout Pacific Theater. Other units requested copies. Training commands incorporated his data into revised technical manuals. Engineers back in the States studied his reports, trying to understand why decades of their own testing had missed what Lindbergh had discovered through practical experience. The thing is, Kowalski explained to a visiting group of maintenance officers, the engineers weren't wrong about the principles. They were wrong about the application. They tested these engines on stands, in laboratories, under controlled conditions. Mr. Lindbergh tested them in the air, over thousands of miles, under real operational stresses. Turned out, reality worked different than laboratory predictions. That distinction mattered. It suggested that expertise, real expertise, came from experience rather than theory, that the men doing the work might understand things the men writing the manuals had missed. It was a lesson that went far beyond aviation, reaching into every aspect of military operations and organizational learning. By the time Japan surrendered, in August 1945, Lindbergh's fuel management techniques had become so thoroughly integrated into standard P-38 operations that new pilots arriving in theater had no idea there'd ever been controversy about them. The techniques weren't Lindbergh's methods anymore. They were just how you flew a P-38 on long-range missions. Standard procedure. The way it had always been done, as far as anyone knew. Which was perhaps the ultimate vindication. Not recognition, or awards, or formal acknowledgement, but complete acceptance. The transformation from revolutionary to routine. From controversial suggestion to standard operating procedure so thoroughly adopted that its origins became footnote rather than headline. MacDonald sometimes wondered what would have happened if Lindbergh hadn't knocked on that screen door, if he'd never shown up at Hollandia, if the most famous aviator in the world had decided Pacific combat operations weren't worth his time. How long would it have taken to discover those fuel efficiency techniques through normal trial and error? How many more pilots would have been lost calculating glide ratios over empty ocean? The questions haunted him during quiet moments, because the answers suggested that innovation often depended on accident and timing rather than systematic evaluation. That critical improvements might be delayed or missed entirely because everyone believed the conventional wisdom. That the difference between success and failure sometimes came down to whether the right person showed up at the right moment with the right question. The P-38 Lightning continued flying combat missions until the war's end. Missions that would have been impossible in early 1944 became routine by 1945. Strikes deep into Japanese-held territory. Extended patrols over vast ocean expanses, escort, missions protecting bombers on raids that determined the war's outcome, all made possible by techniques that challenged everything the military had believed about engine management. When historians later analyzed American air operations in Pacific Theater, they focused on aircraft production numbers, pilot training, programs, strategic bombing campaigns, and island-hopping logistics. The fuel efficiency breakthrough that extended P-38 combat radius by 30% rarely merited more than footnote. Too technical, too specific. Not dramatic enough for general audiences who wanted stories about aerial combat and strategic decisions. But the pilots who flew those missions knew. The ground crews who maintained those engines knew. The commanders who planned operations that previously would have been impossible knew. They understood that sometimes the most significant victories came not from superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but from questioning assumptions and being willing to test unconventional ideas. The lesson was simple, profound, and difficult for organizations to accept. Sometimes the experts are wrong. Sometimes the manual needs rewriting. Sometimes a civilian knocking on your door knows more about your own equipment than decades of military training has taught you. And sometimes saving fuel means winning battles. Long after the war ended, long after the P-38 Lightnings were retired to museums and scrapyards, long after most people forgot there was controversy about engine management techniques, the fundamental lesson remained. Question everything. Test assumptions. Trust evidence over tradition. Be willing to learn from anyone, anywhere, regardless of rank or credentials or how things have always been done. Because that fuel gauge didn't lie. It never did, and the numbers it showed on that July afternoon in 1944 changed everything. The smoke cleared long ago. The war moved from memory to history. The men who flew those missions grew old or passed on, carrying stories that seemed less remarkable with each passing year. But the truth remained, written in mission logs and maintenance records and fuel consumption data that couldn't be argued with. Sometimes one person, asking the right question at the right time, can change the outcome of a war, not through heroism or sacrifice or dramatic action, but through quiet competence and willingness to challenge. What everyone knows is true, that's what Charles Lindbergh did in the summer of 1944. He walked into a tent in New Guinea and suggested that maybe, just maybe, the best fighter pilots in the Pacific were flying their aircraft wrong. And he was right. The rest is just mathematics.